Hello, and thank you for joining us. We are streaming from the Nantucket Field Station, and my name is Yvonne Valancourt. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar. Thanks again for joining us. We're very excited to be streaming once again from the Nantucket Field Station. We are a facility of UMass Boston, and we run classes and we support a lot of researchers, not only from UMass Boston and from the UMass system, but from a wide range of institutions, universities, and agencies. We are very pleased to be offering this webinar. It's a two-part event. The first part of it is a talk, and the second part is a discussion. For those of you viewing over YouTube, you'll notice there is a top chat box, and as long as you're viewing this with the live stream, you can type in a comment or question at your leisure, and we will incorporate it into most likely the discussion section on the latter part of the event. So once again, I welcome you. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Lissa Herzing from the UMass Boston Historical Archaeology Department. And the latter part of the discussion includes more people from UMass Boston's Historical Archaeology, as well as Kamal McCarthy. We're waiting for Kamal to join us, and we do hope that he will be here. That is the plan. And so we are very fortunate to have these people here tonight. So it's not only a wide range of institutions, but it's a wide range of topics and scholarly activities that the field station supports. And the theme this evening is African American archaeology on Nantucket. And I'm really thrilled. Alyssa is about to share the screen and show us her slides, and you'll see her any second now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Lissa Herzing, and I am a third-year student in the University of Massachusetts Boston Historical Archaeology Master's Degree Program. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Yvonne for organizing this remote talk and for inviting me and my colleagues to be a part of it. I would also like to acknowledge the history of the land on which I stand and conduct my research. The Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, the Wampanoag, the Mashpee, the Nauset, and the Narragansett, indigenous communities of the Boston and Nantucket regions, for thousands of years have lived on and protected this land, and continue to shape the lived experience of New England in the present. I'm very excited to share my passion with you all, as well as the incredibly rich and fascinating history of the Seneca Boston-Florence Higginbotham House on the island of Nantucket. At the end of my presentation, I'll be joined by my colleagues, Erica Lang, John Crawmer, and Jared Muehlbauer from UMass Boston, as well as Kamal McCarthy from the Museum of African American History, to further discuss African diasporic archaeology and heritage work in New England. Today I'm going to talk with you about what archaeology is, what we can learn from artifacts, the importance of researching historically marginalized populations, and finally, I will tell you specifically about my thesis research on ceramics from the Seneca Boston-Florence Higginbotham House site, owned by the Museum of African American History. What is archaeology? Archaeology is the study of past human life through material culture. There are archaeologists that conduct work on all time periods of human life and geographic regions, including and not limited to the study of ancient human ancestors through fossilized skeletal remains, the classical archaeology of Greece and Rome, Egyptology, archaeology of indigenous peoples in the Americas, and more recent time periods, such as in my case, the 19th century in the United States. The master's program at UMass Boston is training me to be a historical archaeologist. Historical archaeology is the study of the more recent past through material culture, the recent past being defined by the growth of global imperialism and colonization in conjunction with the presence of written records and documentation, using both the documentary record and artifacts to understand the past is central to the field of historical archaeology. This approach allows historical archaeologists to complete or even contradict narratives of the past. Historical archaeology is also characterized by the pursuit of questions about the past regarding the social, political, and the economic. Each subdiscipline or interest area of archaeology has their own suite of questions that they're aiming to answer about the human condition. Yet they're all connected by their basic methodology: excavation and its associated meticulous record keeping. Excavation is conducted in a very precise way, making sure to maintain the highest level of context for any artifacts or features that may be found. Each different soil layer is removed using shovels or hand trowels, and corresponding paperwork is filled out by the excavators for each layer of soil. Here is an example of two connected excavation units from the 2014 excavations conducted at the Boston-Higginbotham House. As you can see, the individual standing in the unit is using a shovel to carefully skim off layers of dirt, paying attention to any changes in soil color or texture. All soil that is removed from the excavation unit is then put through a screen and carefully checked for smaller artifacts that might not be seen as you are digging. So why do we do archaeology? We do archaeology first and foremost to learn more about the daily life experiences and history of a group of people or a site. On another level, we also conduct archaeology to comply with historic preservation legislation, which generally requires assessment of cultural impact in construction projects. This effort aims to protect our continent's cultural resources for future generations and researchers. But why would we conduct archaeology in a time period when we have written documentation? History is usually written by the victors, which creates biased accounts of life that is centered around those in power, those who won battles, and those with money and clout. We do archaeology to fill in the gaps that this creation of the historical narrative fostered. Many archaeologists are interested in the daily life experiences of ordinary people, who we often find did extraordinary things to navigate their social, economic, and political positions. In particular, the archaeology of historically marginalized and disenfranchised groups is incredibly important to learn more about the way these groups lived, considering their stories are not often told, shaping a version of American history that highlights the diversity of experiences throughout our nation's history, making these narratives more visible in the present. It is through the material culture of this past that we can reconstruct aspects of daily life. What kinds of artifacts do we find digging at historic sites in New England? Some of you may have found a tiny fragment of glass or ceramic or even an old nail while digging in your backyard. These are some of the most common artifacts that are found at historic sites in New England, ranging in time period from the arrival of pilgrims in 1620 all the way through to the early 20th century. During this period of colonial and United States history, people would dispose of trash on their own properties in large trash middens or even old privies. Through time, soil deposition, both natural and artificial, has buried these trash deposits. These deposits, once excavated, yield household and other types of artifacts that can tell us many different things about the lives of people in the past. Some of the most common materials found are glass, ceramic, metal, faunal and botanical remains, as well as lithics. Archaeologists digging in New England also often find Native American artifacts, which is evidence of their long history of occupancy of New England for thousands of years prior to the colonists arriving from Europe. These can be lithic fragments from stone tool manufacture, pottery, or other materials. My research into the history of the Boston-Higginbotham House on Nantucket uses ceramic sherds to help understand the past, and so I would like to spend some more time highlighting the various aspects of daily life that can be gleaned from this evidence. Ceramic fragments represent the dishes that people use to prepare and consume their meals, as well as the food storage vessels and sometimes even decorative figurines. We can glean a plethora of information from ceramic fragments, such as status difference, patterns in food consumption, the practice of entertaining guests, and engagement with ideologies. which I will be talking with you more about today in regards to my own research. Something so mundane as the dishes one uses was incredibly important in the past, especially in the lives of women, who had domain over the domestic sphere and dictated the use of these wares. Ceramics were also used by archaeologists to figure out the time period that we are excavating. We can analyze the ceramics based on type, method of decoration, the imagery present in the decoration, as well as the vessel forms represented by the sherds, such as bowls, teacups, plates, serving platters, etc. Each of these categories of ceramic analysis help us to reconstruct daily life surrounding dining, entertainment, and food consumption. How can ceramics tell us about engagement with ideology? As has been established by the work of scholars such as Diana Wall, Robert Fitz, Deborah Rotman, and Hadley Kruzak-Aaron, ceramic wares chosen by people during the 19th century are inextricably linked with the white middle-class ideologies such as gentility, the cult of true womanhood, domesticity, respectability, and status. Ceramics are the material link to these various ideologies, and we can directly correlate ceramic wares to choices made by the consumer to select a particular type and the corresponding message that goes with it. Using this established assumption, ceramic data will be the basis for my thesis research, aiming to understand more about the lives of those who lived at the Boston-Higginbotham House. The Seneca Boston-Florence Higginbotham House is located at 27 York Street on the island of Nantucket. The site is incredibly significant to Black history on the island and for the breadth of time it represents, as it was occupied by Black families for almost 200 years. The site, along with the neighboring African Meeting House, is owned by the Museum of African American History, who is working to interpret these sites using both historical and archaeological records. 2 field seasons of excavations have been conducted at the Boston-Higginbotham House by the Fisk Center for Archaeological Research at UMass Boston in conjunction with the museum. The first, in 2008, was led by Dr. David Landon and Dr. Teresa Bulger, and the 2014 season was led again by Dr. Landon and Dr. Nidra Lee. There were also excavations performed at the neighboring African Meeting House in 1993 by Dr. Mary Beaudry and Ellen Birkland, the artifacts from which are now being reanalyzed by the New England African American Archaeology Lab, run by Dr. Lee at UMass Boston. The unit boundaries for each field season are delineated here, as you can see from this composite map. During the 2008 field season, 11 units and 6 shovel test pits were excavated, and a total of 54,418 artifacts were recovered. 11 more units were dug in the 2014 field season, yielding a total of 31,204 artifacts. Together, the work done by the museum and the Fisk Center is an incredibly significant body of archaeological and heritage research about the lives of African-descended people on Nantucket, which has continued to produce new research, master's theses, and publications long after the digging was completed. The published research on this site ranges in material focus from ceramic data to faunal remains, as well as glass and other material categories, and asks questions about identity, foodways, the early 19th or early 20th century domestic reform movement, gender and womanhood, labor, and more. So who are the people who lived at this site for almost 200 years? The first occupants of the home were Seneca Boston, a formerly enslaved man, and his wife Thankful Micah, a Wampanoag woman. Seneca and Thankful raised their 6 children in this home. In 1802, Seneca sold the house and property to his eldest son, Freeborn, who married a woman named Mary in 1804. Freeborn and Mary had 3 children, William, Eliza, and Charlotte, who would grow up at 27 York Street. In 1809, Seneca passed away, and shortly after, Freeborn passed away unexpectedly as well, leaving the home and a part of the property to his widow Mary. The stipulation being that Mary would care for her mother-in-law Thankful until her death. Thankful then passed away in 1812, and the remainder of the estate was split between her children. In 1811, Mary had remarried a man named Michael Douglas, who remained with her in the household along with her children until Mary's death in 1834 at the age of 66. After her death, the home was split between her three children. Eliza and Charlotte would raise their families at 27 York Street through the 1830s and the 1840s, just as their mother had done before them. Charlotte passed away in 1851, and her husband, Charles Groves, would take their two young children back to Brooklyn, New York, where he was raised. Around this time as well, Eliza's husband, Lewis Berry, left Nantucket to move to California. This left Eliza to continue raising her family, and after they were grown, she remained in her childhood home until the 1880s. Eliza left her home to her four nieces and nephews, her sister Charlotte's children, and of the four, Elizabeth Stevens was the only to return to Nantucket after she was widowed. She returned in 1883 to take care of her Aunt Eliza. Elizabeth came to own the entirety of the Boston estate and left it to the children of her sister Phoebe, Caroline Talbot, and George Groves Hogarth in 1914. According to Teresa Bulger, there is no evidence that either Caroline or George lived at the property, and in 1919, the property was sold to a Nantucket man named Edward Weldon. Within 1 year, the property was sold to Florence Higginbotham. Florence would live at 27 York Street for the rest of her life, leaving the home to her only son, whose widow then sold the property to the Museum of African American History in 2001. From this chronology, we learn that the archaeology at the Boston-Higginbotham House can tell us about several distinct time periods of occupations by Black families throughout the 200-year period, beginning in the late 18th century and ending in the late 20th century. The time period I have chosen to focus on in my research is the household of Mary Boston Douglas, Freeborn's widow. Mary was the head of household in 1809 until her death in 1834, and during this period, the home and its occupants continued to grow. Mary was raising her three children and caring for her ailing mother-in-law, Thankful, while maintaining a household. During this period, several additions were added to the home as well, likely to create more rooms for Charlotte's growing family and boarders. The census data from 1830 reflects this growth, with two distinct households being recorded, with the same home and a total of 11 people listed at the residence. These households consisted of Mary and Michael Douglas, William Boston, Lewis Berry, who was a boarder, as well as Charlotte and Charles Groves, their 2-year-old daughter, and 4 other boarders. The early 19th century, as is represented by Mary Boston Douglas's household, was a very important time in the lives of women. This period of the household expansion directly correlates to beginning conversations in public discourse surrounding womanhood and ideologies of domesticity. How do we define domesticity, and how did Black women engage with this ideology in their daily lives? Domesticity during the 19th century was the process of homemaking through both material and spiritual means. According to Barbara Welter, the cult of true womanhood consisted of 4 ideals: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, that were prescribed to white middle and upper class women during the 19th century. It is important to note that the cult of true womanhood was not dominant in white middle upper class American society until the mid-19th century. Therefore, my assessment of the engagement with domesticity in the Boston household considers the early 19th century as a transitional period in which women were beginning to engage with literature describing womanhood. As was established previously, ceramic decorations and patterns have been correlated with dominant 19th century gender ideologies, in particular domesticity and the cult of true womanhood. Therefore, the patterns present on ceramics can be related to symbolism that was used to comment on ideologies, whether commentary was a reinforcement or contradiction. In my analysis, I will be looking at ceramic forms and patterns to understand what symbols are being presented in certain settings. I posit that teacups and other teawares, dining vessels with particular decoration and patterns could have been used in more public settings, whereas privately used vessels would have been decorated differently. However, the engagement with ideologies is complicated by race in the lives of Black women. Black women historians such as Angela Davis, Wilma King, Brittany Cooper, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Valerie Cooper, and others have written extensively about the lives of Black women in the past. These authors describe the movements within the Black community to obtain respectability and racial uplift, the intersectional experiences of Black women, religiosity in the lives of 19th and 20th century Black women, and more. By situating my research within this body of literature, I aim to complicate the notion of domesticity and how it was interpreted by Black women in the early 19th century. Another way in which I will complicate domesticity is through the examination of the work of Black women intellectuals during the early 19th century. Mariah Stewart, a Black woman who published a series of speeches and lectures in the early 1830s in Boston, is considered the first Black woman political writer. In her first piece, published in 1831, titled Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality, she says, quote, "O ye daughters of Africa, awake, awake, arise. No longer sleep nor slumber, but distinguish yourselves. Show forth to the world that ye are endowed with noble and exalted faculties. O ye daughters of Africa, what ye done to immortalize your names beyond the grave? What examples have you set before the rising generation?" End quote. She calls on Black women in this passage to distinguish themselves. Stewart goes on in this publication to call on Black women to work together to better their communities, claiming that they could together raise funds to build a school for their children, all while still conducting all of the tasks characteristic of good housewifery. In her address to the African-American Female Intelligence Society in 1832, Stewart describes the significance of the influence of a woman in her audience. Quote, "O woman, woman, your example is powerful, your influence great. It extends over your husbands and over your children and throughout the circle of your acquaintance." End quote. It is through Stewart's words and the work of other Black women intellectuals that we can reconstruct the responsibilities and influence of Black women within and beyond their households. I will attempt to assess the engagement with these ideals by the Boston women by examining ceramic patterns and decorations from the site. Now let's turn to the ceramic data. The ceramic assemblages from lots O and P, as you can see here delineated in blue and pink respectively on this profile drawing, contained a total of 2,170 ceramic sherds of varying types and decoration. This drawing represents the profile of excavation units 17 and 21 from the Boston-Higginbotham House, with the deposits being analyzed located at about 60 to 75 centimeters below the ground surface. The ceramic sherds found in lots O and P date approximately to the 1820s, during the occupation of Mary Boston Douglas's household. When analyzing ceramics, archaeologists often do not use the raw sherd count data. Instead, we perform a type of analysis called a minimum vessel count. A minimum vessel count analysis aims to determine a minimum number of whole vessels that are represented by an assemblage of fragments. This enables archaeologists to think about a particular household's collection of dishes as they would have been used in the past, rather than looking at a much larger number of individual sherds. This analysis requires detailed examination of the ware type, decoration, and patterns of all ceramic sherds in a particular context, and then in between associated contexts as well. Here you can see a tray of small sherds and then a more detailed image of 3 unique vessels that were identified through this process. The minimum vessel count for lots O and P was conducted in the fall of 2018 by myself and John Crawmer, one of my fellow panelists today, and serves as the basis for my analysis. We found that there is a minimum of 178 vessels in the 2 lots being analyzed, out of the 2,170 individual sherds. Vessels are present for each major ceramic ware type: redware, creamware, pearlware, whiteware, ironstone, and stoneware. I am presenting here a breakdown of the vessels by decoration type because ceramic patterns and decoration are the focus of my thesis. Hand-painted vessels are the most prevalent in the assemblage, with the 2 categories of monochromatic and polychrome totaling 32% of the assemblage. Transfer print follows at 24%, with 18% of the ceramic vessel assemblage being not decorated, 10% having shell edge decoration in either blue or green, 7% are molded, and the remaining decoration types of mocha, slip decorated, decal, and gilt are each at less than 3% of the total assemblage. This data shows us that there was a preference for hand-painted and transfer-printed wares among the Boston-Douglas household. Of the 178 vessels I evaluated, that there were approximately 120 vessels that had enough diagnostic characteristics to have their pattern or decorative motif be identified. This group of vessels includes all methods of decoration. Of this number, 33 vessels are transfer printed, and these transfer printed vessels were my main focus for the pattern identification analysis I conducted, which I will talk about in a minute. But before I share the patterns I have identified, I want to briefly talk about the significance of hand-painted pearlware designs. Floral and hand-painted pearlwares were cheaper and more readily available than transfer-printed wares during the early 19th century, which is during Mary Boston's period as head of household. So their presence suggests that she was purchasing quite a lot of these wares around the time that they were produced. Another important thing to note about these vessels is that they were exclusively tea-related vessels such as teacups, saucers, teapots, and others. We know from the written record that tea vessels were used at almost every meal for consumption of liquids, and that hand-painted teawares likely represented Mary's set of more utilitarian, everyday use drinking vessels. In order to identify the transfer printed patterns represented in the assemblage, I first photographed each vessel in order to have comparative images. I then consulted the internet, specifically the Transferware Collectors Club Transferware database, as well as pattern books produced by collectors to identify the patterns. This process was difficult considering many of the sherds present in the assemblage are only rim sherds and therefore do not contain any of the central image design of a pattern. Once a pattern was identified, all patterns made by a particular maker or with a certain style border were examined to make sure I was not misidentifying a pattern. The first pattern I identified depicts a mother bird protecting her nest of eggs, which bring to mind ideas of nurturing as well as nature. In this pattern, there is both a teacup and small bowl present in my assemblage. The next pattern is Waterfall, or Falls of Killarney, which depicts a group of figures reclining at the bank of a river with cows and some ruins in the distance. Such a scene is very romantic and highlights the importance of people appreciating nature and history. The vessel with this pattern in my assemblage is a plate. The pearl pattern is a part of the Florentine China series produced by Samuel Alcock & Co., which depicts idealized romantic landscape featuring differing subjects. This pattern particularly contains figures walking through a landscape with a set of beehives and a beautiful structure in the background. This is another very romanticized image, but the presence of the beehives also suggests that the pattern could symbolize the importance of industry and collective work. The vessel in my assemblage with this pattern is a plate. This next pattern is called Gun Dogs and depicts a man with two dogs hunting a game bird, likely a pheasant. This activity could be related to subsistence and food acquisition, but perhaps is instead a representation of a leisurely or status-related activity of hunting. The vessel with this pattern is a bowl in my assemblage. The Flower Frenzy pattern, the next pattern, is a very busy dark blue pattern depicting a bird and roses, which similarly to the mother bird pattern is very nature-focused. And the vessel in my assemblage with this pattern is also a bowl. This pattern is called Homeward Bound and depicts two men coming home from a long day's work to a rustic cabin with two women conversing in the background. This image is an idealized representation of rural life in America. Perhaps this pattern symbolized for the Bostons the importance of hard work and coming home at the end of the day. The vessel in my assemblage with this pattern is a teacup or tea bowl. Lastly, I have also identified 4 vessels that are willow pattern or another indeterminate chinoiserie style pattern. The blue willow pattern specifically depicts an Asiatic scene with a pagoda and a river, as well as stylized willow trees and sometimes human figures. The presence of these types of patterns suggests an interest in the foreign and exotic, but were also very popular in the early 19th century, as chinoiserie was a predominant style for early transfer printed wares and early hand-painted blue pearl wares. The vessel forms present with this type of pattern in my assemblage are a saucer, several plates, and a bowl. So what do all of these different patterns and their forms tell us about Mary Boston Douglas and her household? The overarching symbolism that is present on the patterns just described are romanticism, purity, and nature, nurturing or mothering, leisure activities, industry, and rural life. I believe that these symbols were being used to signal ideas to both members of the community and household through public and private use of ceramic wares. Several of the patterns discussed, as well as the hand-painted floral pearlwares, represent tea-related vessels. The presence of both transfer-printed and hand-painted teacups suggests to me that Mary had 2 distinct sets of teawares that were used for different occasions. The hand-painted floral teawares were likely the wares used every day at each meal, while the transfer-printed wares were used when there was company at the house. Therefore, the imagery on the transfer-printed wares of romanticism and landscapes as well as industry were being signaled to those who entered the Boston home. The same applies for the plates found in this assemblage, shell-edged plates being used for everyday consumption and the transfer-printed plates being used when others were joining the dinner table. Through this process of bringing others into the home, I suggest that Mary was engaging with the public sense of womanhood as discussed by Mariah Stewart and others in the 1830s. But this might not have been because of the prescription of ideology and gender roles in the mainstream media. Ideas of nurturing embodied in the mother bird pattern suggest that Mary likely held the sentiment of caring for her community, whether if that was through taking in boarders or conversing and helping other women in her neighborhood. I posit that the signaling of ideas of romanticism and nature, as well as nurturing and leisure activities, were part of an effort by Mary and her family to promote ideas of racial uplift in their community. Ideas of racial uplift would have also been communicated to the wider community of New Guinea through the African Meeting House, which was constructed during this time period, and the Bostons were members of this institution. The choices in ceramic patterns and symbols also reflect how Black women were actively molding the ways they viewed themselves as women, countering the harmful stereotypes that Black women have been faced with throughout history. This work aims to show the agency of Black women in the past in shaping their experiences of womanhood. Over the next several months, I plan to develop these ideas further to ultimately complete my thesis research, and I look forward to sharing more with you all in the future. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and thank you to all who've supported me in my research. I would like to now welcome my co-panelists, Erica Lang, John Crawmer, Jared Muehlbauer, and Kamal McCarthy, if he's here. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. You can unmute yourselves, perhaps.
Thank you, Lissa. That was really great. I won't keep the discussion, but I will say that Kamal and I have been behind the scenes. He is here. He's on his phone. Unfortunately, not with video, but Kamal is joining us. So I will back out and let you discuss.
Great. So I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves briefly. So we'll start with Erica and then go to John and Jared and Kamal.
Cool. So thank you for sharing your your research, Lissa. That was great. So generally speaking, my research interests center around intersectional feminism and studies of the African diaspora. Specifically, my research for my master's is currently focused on dress practices at the African Meeting House. I'm looking to see how things like race, class, and gender are influencing identity and dress practices.
Awesome. And I am John Crawmer. I'm doing research on drinking and smoking at the Boston-Higginbotham House. I'm also the director of a public archaeology project in Pennsylvania at a Revolutionary War prison camp.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jared Muehlbauer, also a UMass Boston graduate student, like the other three who have already introduced themselves. My specific research and my master's thesis focuses on examining how the community of New Guinea itself was built with a goal of mapping Black-owned properties in the community from 1750 through 1850. And I'm specifically interested in the importance of community and community spaces, especially, for example, like the African Meeting House, and the roles that these spaces played for Black communities in the 19th century, and how were these communities using these spaces?
Great, thank you so much. So everybody prepared kind of questions, comments. So if Erica, you want to start, we can go that way.
Yeah, sure. So since your research focused in some ways on racial uplift through the navigation of womanhood and domesticity, which was ideology predominantly controlled by white women, do you see an interrogation of respectability politics playing into your work at all?
So that's something that has been one of the things that I've read a lot about, trying to kind of come up with my interpretations of this data. And so Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's work has been really helpful to kind of understand the context of the formation of racial uplift and respectability politics as it was being formed after the abolition of slavery, late 19th century, early 20th century, especially in the context of the Black Baptist women's movement in the early 20th century. And I think it's important absolutely to consider. I didn't specifically use the language there in my presentation because I'm not super confident about it yet in my interpretation. But I think something important to talk about is how Higginbotham kind of conceptualizes of the politics of respectability as a continuum, it being fluid in a way that enables African American people to constantly resist. That's how she kind of talks about it. And in that sense, absolutely, I see Mary's choices in ceramics as, countering those negative stereotypes, which I absolutely think is a form of resistance that could be seen under this umbrella of respectability. However, I definitely want to steer clear of some of the more controversial sort of like interpretations of respectability, that it was more of an assimilative practice. I don't want to think about it that way at all. Black people in the past absolutely had agency over the things that they were doing. And so kind of modeling after a dominant white sort of system is not probably what they were doing. They were making something that was their own and taking pieces of different things and putting them together in a way that worked for them.
Cool. I have a question.
Yeah.
Alyssa? Yeah. All right. So how do the choices in ceramics that Mary Boston is making, how do they compare to other generations of Bostons?
That's a really good question. So that is still something that I'm working on. I'm doing a comparative study in reference to the earlier time period, because I do want to see that transition and what that looks like Teresa Bulger in her dissertation talks a lot about a kind of large collection of shell-edged wares that Thankful Mica would have been a part of curating. And in the ceramics that we looked at, I don't really see a lot of that, which is interesting to me, that there is an absence of the more utilitarian type wares other than the hand-painted pearlware tea wares that I was talking about. So there's definitely more of a distinct sets of the tea wares that are different rather than the dinner plates, which I think might be something that's different from the earlier time period. But stay tuned, that will be further.
Yes.
I have my own question, and then maybe we'll stop grilling you in particular, Lissa. But I guess, so a lot of my research has been interested in getting at these kind of broader questions of community, because we obviously have this amazing site that looks at the Boston, Douglas, Groves, and Barry, like all of these families. But can you see in your kind of ceramic analysis the role that Mary and her daughters, Eliza and Charlotte, were playing in the community at all?
So I do, because I think that they were actually like bringing people into the home, not just for entertaining purposes, but perhaps even, I don't want to like insinuate sewing circles, but perhaps something of that nature, because we do know in the early 19th century that household production was still a thing. And so having a woman head of household, where Mary was sometimes listed as a domestic servant, but then also as a housewife, and her daughters being listed as working in the community as domestics, they were doing all these different things, both household production, but also working outside the home. So I think that they were bringing community in as a way of engaging with people over different tasks that they were conducting. That's at least what I can see with the ceramics, I think.
Yeah, no, that's very cool.
I have a question. This is Kamal McCarthy.
Hi, Kamal.
How are you?
Good.
Congratulations, and well done by the speech, by the way. For everyone else who's listening, my name is Kamal McCarthy, and I'm the Associate Director of Nantucket Operations for the Museum of African American History. I am literally responsible for the site and for sharing Nantucket's African American Black heritage with museum visitors. Random fun fact, I'm also a doctoral candidate at Northeastern University's College of Professional Studies, and my research focuses on repeat visitation to the African Meeting House by African American locals that visit the island. And with all that just said, in a big mouthful to introduce myself, my question is, which is going to be a really big question, how does your work contribute to telling us more about African American domesticity through ceramic evidence, but African American female work in a more larger context? So how does it contribute to just understanding Black households headed by women?
Yeah, that is a big question. Let's see. Well, so something that we don't often think about is, well, at least I think about it a lot, maybe other people don't, but the amount of work that actually goes into running a household, right? And this unseen labor that is done by women, both white and Black, throughout different time periods, but in particular Black women, and the unseen labor that they do on top of outside labor. And so it's this massive combination. But often that unseen labor, that's the area where we're getting at these ideals of domesticity and possible engagement with those things. And so the ceramics are very much so linked with the different aspects of that engagement. So I think that they do contribute. Let's see. I'm not sure. Should I go bigger than Boston?
No, that's perfect. For me, that's a perfect answer. So thank you.
I think too, not to piggyback on a little bit on what you're saying, Lissa, to me, you know, not just looking at the labor that they're doing in the household, but the labor of forming and maintaining community relationships, right? If they are hosting other people from the community in their home, that's where support networks get made. That's where friendships develop. That's all. I don't want to say it's work, because it's not work in the way that like you earn money from it, but it's work in the way that like that's how you build a community. And I think that's a really important role that I get out of kind of your analysis that these women were having within the kind of broader community of New Guinea as well.
Yeah, it's like an emotional aspect of labor. We can call it that, I suppose. Or it's even more the idea of like mothering a community rather than just like the people in your household. Yeah.
And I think a really big aspect of this that you mentioned, Lissa, is visibility. A lot of this sort of work inside the household isn't going to be found in the historic record. The Bostons were a pretty preeminent family within New Guinea, but we don't know nearly as much about the Boston women as we do the men. So again, that's sort of the importance of this research and the importance of doing the archaeology in general, really. So.
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up, John.
And your work also helps us to codify actual oral history as well, too. I know you talk about specifically about an earlier household, but the Florence Higginbotham, the second namesake of the household, there are oral stories of members living on Nantucket today of her having people over, having guests over for tea parties and so forth. And it contributes to Jared's point. I've had the pleasure of meeting both you and Jared. A lot of your viewers may not know that. It does contribute to this fact of building community, and also contributes to my own personal research of using the theory of other mothering and the necessity of like having people in the same place, which the African Meeting House also provided. And one other point that I just want to bring up in the conversation really quickly is that your research also allows me to specifically tell people that there has been over 80,000 artifacts, specifically unearthed from the ground that they are now standing upon, because they have to be at 27 or 29 York Street for me to be speaking to them. And your work allows me to actually show them that not only what was taken from the ground, but now specifically what they were used for. And for that, I just want to say thank you, because it allows me to contribute to my own work specifically without you even finishing your actual write-up.
Well, we're so happy about that. I mean, that's what all of us really want, is we want this work to be visible and to be used and to inform the public. So absolutely, that's so great, Kamal.
Speaking of the public, and I'm so glad that you could pipe in, Kamal. I'm really happy you're here. I wish we could see you as well. But here's some questions. One from Mary Longacre. Are there records of household expenses showing purchases of household items that have been found on the site? And there's one other question, but I'll ask that when you're done.
Sure. So anybody else can piggyback off of this as well, but I believe that there are some sort of account book records for the Seneca thankful period of the household. I don't believe that there are for the Mary Boston Douglas household time period in which I'm looking at. The record that I'm thinking of is we have record that he bought like tea and sugar and some other things that Seneca did. So that's the only one that I can think of off the top of my head. Unfortunately, there's like limited primary source documentation other than his probate record, which is interesting as well.
Another question as well, unless anyone wanted to add to that. But since I'm talking, I'll throw this other question out. It's similar. How can you tell which generations procured which ceramic pieces? And that was from Connor Imhoff.
Thank you for that question. That's a fun one. So I didn't have enough time to get into the whole dating of ceramics type thing, but we have very intense and specific records from potteries over in Britain, which is where many of these ceramics were imported from during the late 18th and early 19th century specifically. And there are some concrete sort of dates for different methodologies of manufacture. So archaeologists are taught all of these things in their methods courses, where we get to look at all these ceramics and have to tell the difference between all of them and put them kind of in a timeline of production. So in the time period that I'm looking at, we have this stuff called pearlware, which is a white-bodied earthenware ceramic that has a bluish kind of glaze on it. But then as soon as we get towards like 1830s and 40s, we start to see whiteware, which is another white-bodied earthenware, but looks more crisply white rather than blue. So there's all these little subtle differences in manufacture that help us to figure out what time period things are from. You can tell this is what I do because I just love ceramics.
Another big piece of that is context too. So, yeah. So the profile that Lissa showed in her presentation, all the artifacts were collected from that layer in the soil, and the artifacts from that layer we dated to the time period of Mary Boston Douglas.
Great. So I guess I'll pose some of the questions we've kind of talked about briefly before we begun this lovely discussion. How do we see all of this work contributing to present efforts for racial justice and equality in our country and increasing visibility of African American history in particular?
Professional perspective, for me, it allows us for me to evidence to visitors that come to the museum that not only does the physical house represent the fact that African Americans have been here since 1774, perhaps long before that as well too, but there's physical evidence from the earth actually, that proves that they were here. Whether it's ceramics, whether it's animal bones, which tell us the different meals that they ate, whether it's with the actual stories of the things that they overcame, whether it's in regards to equal education or their contribution to maritime history. That Nantucket Island, 30 miles out at sea within itself, has a rich history dating back to the 1700s, again, probably even a little bit earlier. So for me, that's how it contributes to this whole idea of racial justice and racial equality, recognizing that your history, Nantucket history, extends back really far.
I think that's I think that's a big piece of it for me too, is that what I like about archaeology is there's a physicality to it. There's things that you can show, which really helps. But I think too, aside from the physicality of it, aside from really tangibly anchoring Black history on Nantucket all the way back, through the 1700s, probably earlier, as Kamal said. It also, to me, what stands out when we look at these communities and the documents that they produce and all of their writings that we do have is that, what they're asking for in the 1800s is the same things that we are hearing being asked for today. They're asking for safe and healthy places for themselves, for their families, for their community. They're asking for equal opportunities for their lives and the lives of their children. And that really the difference is just time and the specific context in which they're asking for these things. But it really allows us, if we understand this as a struggle which has a really deep past, archaeology can kind of look at, well, how did, members of New Guinea, how did members of the Boston household engage in this? How did they fight for these things? How did they how were they activists for these things in the 1800s? And what can that tell us about, where we still need to go today, what tactics they used and what lessons they may have to teach us as we're still fighting a lot of the same, we're still grappling with a lot of the same issues even today.
Thank you, Jared, for that. And thank you, Kamal, too, for adding that information in. I think you both hit it on the head. I mean, we have something that's physical evidence that we can show people. And I think that's why doing these sorts of things and teaching people about archaeology is so important, because even in our history classes in school, I mean, even myself, as somebody who went to high school between 2009 and 2013, I didn't really learn about archaeology or anything, any sort of data produced by that in history class. And so our history books that our children are reading are still sort of biased in that way. And I think using our work to try to change that would be I mean, it's something that a lot of people are doing, and it's something that's worth a lot of our time, especially for molding the minds of young people.
So with that point, how and when will some of these artifacts be available to the public?
We can talk about that. I'm definitely not the person to make that decision, but these are yours, right? So we're the repository. We want to help you guys do interpretive things, come up with exhibits, and produce all of that, and get artifacts to you guys on Nantucket to display so that people can see them, because it is so important to see the physical thing. And so that is something that, at least while I'm still here, I want to help make that a thing, make that a tangible product. And so I'd love to continue working on that with you, Kamal, and with Nidra, and with Dave Landon. So that would be something really awesome to come out of this.
We look forward to working with you, and thanks again for agreeing to be our 2026 Briggs Lecture speaker.
No problem. Thank you.
I have maybe somewhat of an out-of-the-blue question for you, Kamal. But is there anything else, or I guess anything that kind of springs to mind from some of what Lissa has talked about, that I guess other questions that you have about the archaeology, or other kind of avenues of research that would be helpful to you in your own personal research, or as part of the museum who's trying to interpret this site for the public? Is there anything else that you might be interested in or have questions about?
Honestly, I'm interested in all of it. I'm interested in reading each of your master's write-up when they are ready for publication. This work specifically fascinates me because I'm always asking visitors to specifically think about the time period when Absalon Boston would set sail on the ship, the Industry, in 1822. I asked visitors to specifically think about, well, what will the women be doing at that time? Obviously, the community of New Guinea would have continued operating, the shops, the schools, the churches, and so forth. All of that would have continued. And this, again, specific work that we have just watched today allows me to shift that question. Like, well, this is what Mary was specifically doing. Or this ceramic evidence shows some of the things or activities that she may have been participating in. So, again, I don't really have anything specific to ask or to share, just that I'm looking forward to research it because it only enriches the information that I get to share with visitors to the.
I guess to broaden our focus a little bit, Erica, since your research looks specifically at the African American community in Boston and the sister site of Nantucket's site, the Museum of African American History, centered there in Boston, do you see any parallels kind of with what you're seeing with what Lissa's talking about, or I guess how do you see this as like a comparative site to what we're seeing on Nantucket?
So I think they're eerily similar. The meeting house in Boston is, it was, the backbone of like Black activism in the 19th century. And, it was the place where community events were held, like their dinners, their celebrations, like that's where it happened. And I think the same thing is happening at the meeting house in Nantucket. It was more than, their church. They educated their youth. They held community events. They were building their community around like activism and abolition in both places. So yeah, I think they're kind of the same in a lot of ways.
I'm very interested in hearing how you guys came to do what it is you're doing. Did you know when you were in high school, for example, that you wanted to become a historical archaeologist? And this includes everybody, Kamal, you as well. How did you arrive where you are in this study?
So I kind of knew I always wanted to be an archaeologist ever since I was, pretty young, but I don't think I knew what it meant or the full capacity of what was possible. So when I went to undergrad, I went to SUNY Potsdam in New York State, and Jared also went there. We're alum together, and so I wasn't really totally aware of what archaeology could be. And then my intro class, I mean, you start to learn about all the amazing sites and all the amazing things that people have done, and it really changed my perspective because I learned that archaeology could be used in the present to be, political in helping to change what is going on now and potentially our future. Learn from the past to understand where we're going. Don't make your same mistakes, all of that sort of thing. And I really latched onto that and feel very passionately about this work being incredibly relevant now and being political in that way. We can't just be unbiased scientists sitting in a lab somewhere, and we have to be out there working with people and descendant communities and talking to others who don't necessarily have the same sort of backpack of knowledge that we have. And so that's kind of how I came to it. Yeah.
I'll hop in next. So I didn't really know I wanted to be an archaeologist until college. It had been something that I had always had an endless fascination with, but I think because I didn't know about archaeology, I just didn't know that archaeology could be used to understand contemporary issues, or could be used to understand, social inequality of the past. And then when I made that connection, because that is what I want to do, whatever I end up doing, I want my work to contribute in some way, to our understanding of inequality in the past or present. And so I think when I made that connection, that was kind of just it, archaeology is cool in that way.
I agree. Archaeology is cool. I also always wanted to be an archaeologist. And for me, the biggest thing about archaeology that I really enjoy is using archaeology to engage with the public generally. So on the project that I run, we have descendant communities actually do the excavation, volunteer and do the excavation. And it's really awesome. I especially for historic sites. I've done some excavation in Israel, and when you look at a potsherd, let's say, from Israel that could be from 500 BC, you say, oh wow, 500 BC, but you have no idea how long ago that is. Really, your brain doesn't really click. But if you look at something from the 1800s, for most people that clicks, you understand, and there you can see a real connection to that object. And so that's why I like archaeology. Always wanted to be an archaeologist, and I'm happy to be one.
I guess I'm happy to go next. I didn't necessarily always want to be an archaeologist, but when I started looking at colleges, I knew I wanted to do something in history. And so at first that was just become a history teacher, because I put very little thought into it beforehand and was just that's, I guess, what you do if you want to do something in history. But I visited SUNY Potsdam, where Lissa and I both graduated from, and was really impressed with the archaeology program there. They really they sold themselves very well, which they're a great program. But it really, walking into that first class and taking some of these archaeology and anthropology classes, what really grabbed me is that we don't always think a lot about what's missing when we talk about the past. And we have a very specific idea of what the past is. And it's referenced all the time in our politics and our economics and our social institutions. We reference the past all the time. But what really stuck out to me is archaeology's ability to get at what's not talked about a lot, and highlight some of the gaps that we have, because those gaps are there for a reason. They're there because our society is still very much an unequal one. And so that's really what grabbed me and held me. I did leave archaeology for about a year because I was not sure. You get too wrapped up into the academics of it sometimes, and you're like, what's the point? I'm just publishing for no reason. But what I really came back is really reading the work of archaeologists like Maria Franklin, like our advisor at UMass Boston, Nidra Lee, who really say, no, well, this isn't just for academic purposes, that this has to be something that is for the public, that is something that engages with issues that are interesting, are current, and that it has to be that, and that it can be that. And that's what brought me back. And that's why I do this. It doesn't happen a lot. We spend a lot of time in the lab counting little pieces of pottery, and we spend a lot of time staring at computer screens. But the little moments where you get to actually work on something that feels like it matters, that's what really sticks out to me.
I did not study archaeology, and I'm not an archaeologist. But I can quickly say that I got involved in museum studies thanks to the classic Nantucket connection of the previous site manager asking me my interest, and that's how I specifically got involved. I did study anthropology and African American studies as my minor concentrations as undergrad. So and knew that archaeologists can help to make my museum work easier. So that's my only direct connection to the field.
Thank you all so much. It's really interesting to be able to get you together and to listen to this and to think about some of the points you made that maybe we don't always think about when we hear of archaeology. One last question is, what was the most interesting thing, if there is one, that you uncovered in this work?
For me, it was the Liberty coin from 2014 that they unearthed.
Yeah, I guess there's a tie for like my favorite artifacts right now. One being from last year's field season at Plymouth, which is also through UMass Boston. We found a patent farthing that dates to basically when the Pilgrims showed up, and that was the coolest thing ever, getting to see an artifact that was literally from when they arrived here. And my second favorite, or tied favorite, would be a pair of Swan Scissors that were found at the John Brown Farm in New York State, which was a project that Jared and I worked on together. And Swan Scissors would have been used by women for like embroidery work. And that was just so cool to me.
I think my favorite find must have been from a colonial era native site in Massachusetts. And it was a worked piece of glass. So that means someone would have chipped at it or flaked it like they would have worked lithics. So that's pretty cool.
Last week I was excavating in Pennsylvania, and we found a very lovely triangular point about 3 feet in the ground in a shovel test pit, which was pretty cool. I'm writing a lot about it right now, so that's why it's like on my mind. It was the tip had broken off, and whoever had been using it actually retouched it, retooled it, and turned it into a scraper. So that was pretty cool. Yeah.
I'm going to be weird and not pick an artifact for mine, which Lissa will laugh at because she knows I'm an archaeologist who's not a big artifact person. But for my thesis, I've been going through a lot of property records, which are real dull, and 19th century handwriting is really, really awful. But there's something about seeing someone buy their home, which is really cool for the first time. So I think that's probably, for me, one of the biggest things. And I don't know if there's any certain one that comes to mind, but that's been really cool for me, is actually to be coming in and being like, oh, this is this is the deed where someone like bought their house that they were going to raise their family in. And that was really cool.
We're getting close to the end of our discussion. I was interested in knowing if among all of the work you did, if some of it would be able to still be used in a way down here with some of the people that might visit, to do some sort of hands-on, real-time kind of activity at the meeting house.
I would say yes. I mean, like I said before, I'm not the authority on the possession of the artifacts, but we can definitely organize something maybe once we're allowed to be around people again, whenever that may be. But absolutely, yes. No, I mean, I've only been to the island once, and I study it, and I want to come back so many more times. So give me an excuse, and I'll be there.
Yeah, I think that's a big goal. I mean, unfortunately, we're all students, so we, don't have the power to like make the call to be like, yes, we're coming with a box of boxes on Tuesday. But it is a big goal for all of our advisor, or all of ours advisor. I don't know how to say that. Nidra Lee, who is all of our academic advisors. That's how you say that. That's a big goal of our lab, and a big goal of her work is to make sure that unfortunately we need to finish what we're doing, but then once that is finished, that this really needs to be put in a format that Kamal and the museum are able to use it for interpreting the site how they would like. And there's certainly a lot of really cool things that people have done with artifacts, and having, even if they're not the original ones, having like type collections that people can touch and hold and pick up, that are the same, type of dish that's represented in the collection, and being able to have a lot of those things. So without having any authority to say that we can, that's definitely a goal of our lab that we're all a part of, for sure.
Are there any other planned excavations down here?
So it's definitely on Dr. Lee's mind. She desperately wants a comparative household site, because right now we just have the meeting house and the Higginbotham House, which is an institution versus a household. And so having another Black household would be amazing on the island. And so I think we're keeping our eyes peeled for the future.
Thank you so much. This was really very enlightening and interesting. There are plenty of opportunities to come back and talk in person when we can do those things, or to visit us remotely once again. And I really thank every single one of you very much. And Kamal is back. Did you?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. The call got dropped, but if I heard the last question correctly, I just want to also chime in with that. I am equally not an authoritative voice, but if memory serves, the Community Preservation Committee will allow the organization to help towards a education center in which we hope to have, if not some of the physical artifacts, housed in proper temperature items, and at least 3D replicas of them, so that the community or students will be able to interact with them. And I didn't get the second question, but I heard that first one that I missed.
Yeah, the second question was if there were more planned excavations or projects.
Actually, the museum is just looking forward to finishing up our preservation work, which also involves figuring out a plan for how these actual artifacts will be housed on the campus. So as far as projects, we're just looking to finishing the overall project and having it up open to the public as soon as possible post-COVID. But as far as archaeological digs or anything along those lines, I think that may have passed, but that's for probably Dr. Langdon and Nidra and my supervisors to talk about.
In your field of archaeology, are there citizen science platforms or way to pull people in?
There definitely are. Archaeology is weirdly kind of scattered, so they tend to be specific to specific archaeology projects. But I will say that if anyone's interested, I would start with Googling your local university and their archaeology program. A lot of them will have information about summer digs that they do. One of the first experiences educationally that people do in archaeology is a field school. And often, depending on the university, some field schools allow for volunteers. There are definitely projects that take volunteers as well. There's no, unfortunately, I can't like point you to a central like Google this and you'll find a place. But a lot of, especially now, I think archaeology pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID is really interested in giving people the opportunity to come out to sites and try it out and excavate with us and really engage with us with what we're doing. But John actually can probably talk a little bit more about his work too, since his is a very open public archaeology project.
Yeah. So, like I said earlier, my project is pretty much 90% done by volunteers. We have maybe myself and 2 other archaeologists supervising and educating. And the real dark secret is volunteers are great. They're great workers. If more professional CRM companies knew that, then we would all be fired, most likely. But for us, we advertise through local newspapers and things like that. So if somebody's interested in participating in a local archaeology project, sort of check your local paper. There might be something there.
I will actually weirdly plug Archaeology Month is in October. So if you're interested in things archaeology, both the Massachusetts Historical Commission posts, they have a whole list, they get a whole list of archaeology related events that they send out. And a lot of universities and places that have archaeology programs do special events in October for Archaeology Month. And I know that at least in the organizations where I work, there's a big emphasis on making them digital this year. So it's still happening, but maybe not in person.
Well, thank you again so much. And I'll stop asking questions so we can wrap this up. But this was very interesting. And I hope to have something like this again and to see you back down here on Nantucket. So we thank everyone who's tuning into this for your interest, and please feel free to comment on YouTube. The chat box might disappear, but if you watch this and it's not live, you can write a comment and maybe we can answer those questions that you may have. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lissa, so much. This was really great.
Thank you, Yvonne, for organizing, and thank you so much to everyone for joining me. This was really awesome.
Thanks for having us. This was really great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you.